Let's look at some more pattern generators now. One pattern is the palindrome. So a palindrome is something that's the same forwards and backwards, and what the palindrome pattern does is it plays elements from a list forward and then in reverse order. And so the palindrome outputs periods, which are by default the full forward backward traversal of the list. We'll be looking at periods later. And there's some interesting parameter about choices of how to do a palindrome. If you want to repeat the elements on the end, then an input pattern like ABC would go ABC and then CBA, ABC, CBA. But you might not want to repeat the element on the list. Maybe you want A, B, C, B, A, B, C. In that case, you want to elide the endpoints, and the options for the elide keyword are first, so ABC becomes ABC, CBA, but then we elide the A and go right back to B. We can elide the last element. If we set elide to true, then we do both we do elision at the beginning and at the end of the pattern, and false means no elision, and that's the default value. So here's an example of a palindrome. We're passing in pitches C, F, B flat, E flat, A flat with no elision, so we'll hear the first and the last elements be repeated. The score length is 20, and same pattern as before. We create the pattern object, we reference it by calling the next function in an expression within ScoreGen. Here's another example. Here we're going to turn on elision. So that second example was the same pattern, just with a very rapid, very, very short onset interval. Here are some more simple patterns. Random picks elements from a list at random without replacement. So at every point you can pick anything. There are some fancy ways to specify the list of what to pick, where you can give weights. You can also specify the minimum number of repetitions and the maximum number of repetitions once you've picked something. You can read about this, the details in the reference manual. Here's an example. And another example. That last one, you didn't hear anything repeat, so max was set to 1. The next example is make line. Line is kind of a strange pattern, and you might wonder why you would ever want to do this, but what it does is it outputs every element of a list, and then it repeats the last element of the list forever. So here's an example. Okay, that sounds might sound a little silly and useless, but sometimes combining make line with other patterns is very useful to allow you to specify an initial element followed by repetition of something. And here's make accumulation, which takes the initial substrings of the input list and outputs them. So for example, if the input is ABC, we output the sublist A, and then we output the sublist AB, and then ABC, and now we've output all of the sublists, so we start over again. Let's listen to an example. another pattern that's fairly complex, and we'll talk about Markov models later, but it's Make Markov. It's an implementation of Markov models, and you can read about the details in the manual. Pattern object output is structured into periods. So I've alluded to this, and now we're actually going to pay attention to it. The next function on a pattern returns one element, but you can pass the optional parameter true to next, and it will return a list of one full period. So what's a period? A period is just a collection of a subsequence of what is generated by a pattern. And patterns can be defined differently to change the period length and how the period is defined. But there's always a default period. So for example, if I call make cycle of 1, 2, 3, and I say give me an entire period by specifying the true parameter, then I get the list 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3 is the default period for make cycle. And why do we have periods? Well, sometimes patterns do something on every period. Patterns can take an optional parameter, which is this for keyword parameter that tells you how long the period should be. And so the definition of make cycle is every period you update the list, which might involve actually calling a pattern and getting a period, and then you output from that list for one period, and then go to the next value. So this is all an introduction to the idea of patterns, and we'll take a look at this. There's a pattern called make accumulate that sums successive elements from an input pattern. Typically, you would put a pattern object at the beginning of make accumulate, and there's some keyword parameters to change what accumulate does, but basically it takes the first value of the pattern, and then the next thing accumulate outputs will be the sum of the first two elements of the pattern. The next thing accumulate outputs is the sum of the first three elements of the pattern. So obviously these elements have to be numbers so they can be added. Another interesting pattern that operates on patterns is make copier. So what make copier does is it calls the pattern, the first parameter here, to get an entire period, and then it copies that period some number of times specified by the repeat keyword parameter. And so it outputs not just one period of the pattern, but any number of copies of that period before it moves on to the next period of the input pattern. So here's an example of accumulate. We define pitch increment pattern to be make random. So what this is going to do is return a sequence of random numbers from -3 to +3. And then make accumulate is going to operate on or take pitch increment pattern as input, and it's going to form the sum of sequential selections from these random numbers. So the sum of these is going to be this pattern, sometimes called a drunken walk, where starting at some pitch, we make kind of a random move in some direction, and then from there we make another random move, and we're constantly accumulating or summing up these small random offsets. So here is where we call next of pitch pattern. To generate this, we're adding the entire sum to some starting value, which is middle C, and we'll do this for 25 notes. So you can imagine if we took out the -3 and the +3, we would only have intervals of minor seconds. If we had -1 +1, we would have only chromatic scale. If we threw in a 0, we could have repetitions. And so there's a lot of flexibility here, so you can kind of design these sequences. Here's an example using copier. We'll start with make heap, which remember is doing random selection without replacement from this list of inputs. And make copier is going to take every random pattern and repeat it 4 times. So once you repeat anything in music, it starts to have some structure. Instead of just sounding random, now we have kind of random structures. Let's just play this. I hope you could hear that there were almost like little phrases being repeated. They would sound pretty random if they weren't repeated, but your ear really picks up on this repetition. Let's talk some more about patterns of patterns. Here we have a special pattern called make length. And make length doesn't really generate anything new. It just regroups periods from one pattern into new periods according to parameters. So the input pattern from which you get data is the first parameter. The length of periods that these values are regrouped into is the second parameter, which can also be a pattern. Very, very powerful construct, and we'll see examples of this. Another interesting pattern is make window. So the idea of a window is you have some region that you can slide over some data. And so what window does is it takes the incoming sequence, which is specified by a pattern here, and outputs window size elements from that pattern. Window size is the second parameter. And then you skip ahead into the sequence according to window skip and repeat. You output another window size group of elements, and then you skip. So the skip factor can be much smaller than the window size. So for example, here we have the cycle ABCD, a window size of 3 and a skip of 1. So the 3 means we output the first 3 elements, ABC. The 1 means now we skip ahead in the sequence to B, and we output 3 elements, BCD. That's over here. Then we skip ahead one more. Starting on C, we output 3 elements, C, D, and we wrap around to A. So here's the CDA, and we continue doing that. So here is an example of window. In this case, we're going to make a line out of the list C, C#4, E4, F4, A4, B flat 4. So in other words, the last element, B flat 4, will just be repeated, and we'll use that as input to make window, outputting 3 elements and stepping by 1. So let's hear that. Here is a different example where we output 9 elements and we step by 3.